Well, it's certainly a surprise, wouldn't you say? I mean, one minute Donald Trump Jr. and Kimberly Guilfoyle are engaged and making headlines, and the next thing you know, there's talk of Guilfoyle possibly becoming ambassador to Greece, and then we hear about Don Jr. and this new relationship with Bettina Anderson, the
Yeah.
social media influencer.
Yeah, it is kind of a head spinner, isn't it? And, usually we wouldn't get into the whole personal relationships thing, but when you have these big political figures involved, well, people are going to be interested and start asking questions about, what it all means and what kind of influence is at play.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today with this Mediate article. It was actually talked about on this YouTube show called The Ring of Fire. And they really got into these concerns that Trump family, friends, and insiders reportedly have about Don Jr.'s new relationship with Tina Anderson. So we're not here to spread gossip or anything like that, but we want to really dig into what these concerns are all about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to get specific about what people are worried about. Is it about Ms. Anderson's past or her motivations? What's Donald Trump's take on all of this? How are other big players reacting? And then there's this whole rumor about Ms. Anderson maybe wanting a role in a future administration. That's where things get really interesting, that intersection of personal connections and political power.
Okay, so let's break this down. The Mediate article says they got information from 7 anonymous sources, all supposedly close to the Trump family. What really jumped out at you when you first read about what these sources were saying?
Well, the thing that struck me is how strong the language was. They weren't just like, oh, we're a little bit concerned. These people were described as deeply troubled by this whole budding relationship. And it wasn't just some distant acquaintances either. It went all the way up to people close to the former president who are apparently worried about Mrs. Anderson being a potential liability. I mean, that phrase potential liability really stands out, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
suggests that it's not just about whether they're a good match personally. There's this sense that there are bigger risks involved.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then it gets even more specific when you hear about this friend of Donald Jr.'s who felt the need to actually call him up and express concerns about Ms. Anderson's past. There's talk of hard partying and a pattern of dating wealthy men in Florida. Now, of course, Ms. Anderson's representatives have denied all of this. But just the fact that someone felt strongly enough to issue a warning like that is pretty telling, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It really makes you wonder what's driving these concerns. Are they genuinely worried about Don Jr.'s well-being? Or could it be something else, like anxiety about how this will look for the family, or maybe even political fallout? It's always hard to know for sure what's going on behind the scenes with anonymous sources, but the intensity of their reactions suggests that something's up.
And it wasn't just one friend. It sounds like some of Mrs. Anderson's exes have reached out to Don Jr. with warnings, too. Like the YouTube commentary pointed out, there could be some baggage there with exes, obviously. But the idea of multiple people from Ms. Anderson's past independently expressing concern definitely adds another layer to this whole story.
Right. You have to consider that while it's true that exes might have their own perspectives and maybe some bitterness, the fact that we're hearing similar warnings from different sources suggests that there might be a pattern of behavior or a certain reputation that's raising red flags within these circles. It implies that there's a shared perception of Ms. Anderson amongst some of the people who have known her in the past.
And here's where things get even more interesting. The article says that Donald Trump himself is not on board with this relationship. Apparently, a close family friend even said that Bettina's presence is a liability rather than an asset. That's a pretty strong statement coming from someone inside the family's inner circle.
Oh, absolutely. And when you think about the dynamics of a powerful political family, like the former president's disapproval carries a lot of weight. With the Trumps, their personal lives and political lives are often intertwined. So a statement like that could have some serious consequences. Calling Mrs. Anderson a liability strongly suggests that they're worried about bad publicity, increased scrutiny, or even damage to future political plans.
And the concern was serious enough that close Trump confidants supposedly took stories about Anderson's past to the then president-elect. They even suggested that she be barred from the inauguration. And that's a pretty drastic measure. Did you think that says something about how much of a risk they perceived her to be?
It definitely underscores the level of alarm they were feeling. The inauguration is such a symbolic event, and I guess the idea of this relatively new partner being front and center was just too risky for them. They didn't want the relationship and its perceived questionable nature to be part of the historical narrative. It shows how much they prioritize appearances and how worried they are about potential PR disasters, especially at such a high-profile event.
So where does this leave us? We have these anonymous sources expressing serious concerns about Mrs. Anderson's past and her potential to cause problems for Don Jr. and maybe even the whole Trump political sphere. And then you have Mrs. Anderson's representatives firmly denying everything. It's a bit of a confusing picture, don't you think, especially since we're relying so heavily on these insider accounts?
Yeah, it definitely highlights the challenges of interpreting information that comes from anonymous sources, you know? These people might have firsthand knowledge, but you always have to wonder about their motives and any potential biases they might have. And of course, Mrs. Anderson's side of the story is important too. Her representatives are pushing back against these allegations, and we need to consider that.
But then things get even more complicated when you add in this possibility of Mrs. Anderson wanting a role in a future administration. The report mentions rumors circulating within Trump's inner circle about her maybe being interested in a position. Specifically, they mention the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. And Don Jr.'s spokesperson has dismissed this idea, and one Trump insider called it highly unlikely. But the fact that this was even being discussed is pretty significant, isn't it?
It is significant because even though personal relationships are supposed to be private, the moment someone even hints at using those connections for political gain or influence, well, it becomes a matter of public interest. I mean, think about it. If someone with no apparent experience in politics or the arts is suddenly being considered for a position on a committee like that, it's going to raise eyebrows, and people are going to start asking questions about their qualifications and their motivations.
That's such an important point that the YouTube commentary made. If it's just a personal relationship between two consenting adults, then it's really nobody else's business. But if there's even a possibility of an administration role, it changes everything. It goes from being a private matter to something that can have real public implications, especially when you consider the integrity of appointments and the potential for undue influence.
Exactly. The focus then shifts to whether the appointment process is being compromised and whether personal connections are overriding qualifications and experience. Now, the report suggests that it's unlikely Mrs. Anderson will get such a role, but the fact that it was being talked about at all within Trump's inner circle shows that there's at least some concern about her potential influence or ambitions in a political context.
Okay, so let's recap the main concerns that these anonymous sources raised. They're worried about Mrs. Anderson's alleged reputation for partying, her perceived history of dating wealthy men, and the overall idea that she's a liability for Don Jr., and maybe even for Trump's political future. And of course, we have to remember that Mrs. Anderson's representatives have strongly denied these claims. We also heard reports about some of her exes reaching out to Don Jr. with warnings.
Right. And the key tension here is where the line is between personal relationships and the public interest. Ms. Anderson's personal life is her own. But when there are reports about her possibly wanting a role in a future administration, it becomes something the public has a right to know about, especially when they specifically mention the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities, even though some insiders downplayed it. It shows that there are specific concerns about her potential influence in areas where expertise and experience are usually considered essential.
So when you consider everything that's come out in these reports, it really makes you think, what are the implications when someone close to a powerful politician faces this kind of scrutiny? Where do we draw the line between someone's private life and legitimate public interest when those lives intersect with political power and influence? It's a complex issue, isn't it? When personal relationships have the potential to affect the public sphere, it forces us to ask some tough questions. What are your final thoughts on this?
You know, it makes me think about how much our society values privacy, especially for public figures and their families. But at the same time, when those private lives potentially intersect with positions of power and influence, it's understandable that people would have questions and concerns. I guess the real challenge is finding that balance between respecting individual privacy and ensuring transparency and accountability when it comes to matters of public interest. It's a discussion that's not going away anytime soon, and it's one that deserves careful consideration from all sides.
That's a really good point. It's a conversation we need to keep having. Thanks for joining me today for this deep dive. It's been really insightful.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.